And then after that, once you get published, of course, then you have to, that's a whole other life change. Writing on demand is much different than, I always tell new writers, you have your whole life to write your first book and a year to write your second.
Which is why it's not a bad idea to have a second one in the
Right.
drawer when you go sell your first
I would have
one.
loved to have had a second. You know, I've always felt like I'm playing catch-up. I've never, you know, there's some writers I know that when they get published, their series or whatever, they've already got 3 or 4 done. So they can kind of rest a little bit. And I came out of the chute running and haven't stopped.
Well, you were lucky, too, in the sense that Joanne was probably, because of her own work, a sympathetic reader for Fool's Puzzle, and
Right.
that she writes what I would call kind of edgy Western women's fiction.
Right.
And she was a sympathetic reader, I think, for the story that you wanted to tell. You could have had a different instructor who might not have been so grabbed. But anyway, now that we've gone all around it, why don't we talk about Fool's Puzzle? There are 2 things to talk about. One, of course, is the characters and the plot and so forth, but the other has to do with what the book industry today calls the hook. So maybe we should start with the hook and then talk about how that worked out. What is your hook?
Well, it's obviously quilting. When I wrote the first book, Fool's Puzzle, I was not thinking in terms of a series because just starting my new book and thinking that it wasn't going to get published, all I was thinking about is I want to see if I can write a book and get from A to Z. I was so intrigued by the process. I'm such a reader. I love to read. Ever since I was a child, I've been a reader. And I've always been fascinated with how do you write a book? And so my whole thing I was doing with Fool's Puzzle was just this big experiment. You know, can I even do this? And can I put the stuff in it that I really like? Because I love quilting so much. My grandmother's a quilter. My other, on one side, my Arkansas grandmother, my Kansas grandmother always did needlework, so there was a lot of that in my background, and I do needlework as well as quilting, a little bit of quilting. I decided to put that in the book. I made Benny a curator of a folk art museum because I thought that sounded like a fun job, and I wanted to have a quilt show going on. And so I did that, and halfway through the book, I still didn't have a title yet because titles have always been a problem for me. And I was at a quilt show in my local area, and I was walking through, and I was looking at the names of the quilts, and it occurred to me how evocative they are, how they seem to tell a story just with the name of the quilt. I got interested in the history of quilts, started reading about the histories of names, and then it occurred to me, wow, that would be a great title for my first book, which was actually, the first title was Drunkard's Path, which is the same pattern but a different title, which happens often in quilting. That was my first thing that happened to me, was my title got changed, which happens a lot. They thought Drunkard's Path just didn't have the right ring to it. So we renamed it Fool's Puzzle. But Drunkard's Path truly had a metaphor to the story. And that was always my intent, for not the hook to be so much that every book you find a clue in the quilt. I wasn't trying to go for a cute hook. I wanted to go for the metaphor of what quilts mean to women, but also the names and how it works into the story.
So now that you're using quilt titles and that is your hook, what happens first? Do you come up with the name of the quilt and then your story works to that, or do you think of a story and then you select a quilt title that matches the story?
Well, originally, with the first book, I came up with the story first, and then the title made itself known when I was at that quilt show. And then after that, when I did a proposal, when I sent the book in, and we sent in a cover letter and said, you know, we're proposing this series, which is something, you know, Joanne helped me with, we came up with the idea of, gee, this would be a great thing. And I was happy because I would never have to think up a title, which has always been my biggest problem, because I have an encyclopedia of 4,000 quilt patterns. So that solved my problem with that way. So I came up with 2 titles, Irish Chain and Kansas Troubles. And that was written into my contract. I didn't do proposals for the stories because I didn't know what the stories were about. And so I sort of got in a habit of doing that. That's happened with me with all my contracts. I give them a title and say, I will write a story about this. And some of them just lend themselves to stories like Kansas Troubles. I knew I wanted my characters to go back to Kansas because the male character, Gabe, is from Kansas. So that sort of worked its way into it. One of my later ones, one I just finished that will come out next year, Arkansas Traveler. I established early on that her grandmother, Dove, was from Arkansas, so that was an obvious title to use.
And the Seven Sisters, which is your current book, you do in fact have 7 sisters, a descendant of a ranching family.
Right.
And that becomes, you know, part of the story is the number of sisters that started out and the number of sisters we end up with.
Right. So, and the title just was, I knew I wanted to put 7 sisters in there. And that's, I came up with the title first and said, okay, now what can I do with this? And it's very easy to do that with quilt patterns because they are so evocative.
They are, and it also has led to, and we have a display of books here so everybody can see them, I think it has led to some clever packaging by your publisher. And I also suspect that this may have worked both for and against you in the sense that, you know, it's going to appeal to give you an audience of people who may be interested in quilts or, you know, sort of suggest women's fiction and so forth. At the same time, I don't think that your books are really targeted at that audience, and it may be that the packaging, the quilt thing, discourages some people, particularly
Yeah.
male readers, which is
Right.
too bad. So, you know, I can see this as a two-edged deal, you know, that you've got the hook, and that's good, and it's broadened your, you know, gave you an audience. At the same time, it may also limit your audience.
Right, and I think that's this reason we changed the cover with the 6th book. Mariner's Compass has a little bit different cover, not
Sure
quite
it
so.
Well, I can, 7 Sisters, I
The
think,
7 Sisters,
particularly.
another example. That's the second one in the new cover series. And it's a little more mainstream looking because my book's very much borderline mainstream. They do appeal to men. One of the reasons we changed the covers is because of a discussion I had with my editor. Being out on the road and doing the book signings, I get a lot of feedback that New York doesn't get. And I was having so many women say to me, my husband, my brother, my son, they like this book, but I had to force them to read it because I have very strong male characters, and I have very positive male characters in my books. And so once we changed the packaging, it ended up, the sales just went a lot better because men would actually pick up the book. They weren't embarrassed. Where the earlier ones, they were very feminine looking. And
yeah, I think they were, and that was sort of the substance of my remark, that I think that you do have a unisex or a gender neutral, if you want to call it, audience. I think particularly 7 Sisters is really a book about fatherhood. It's a wonderful book. It's a Father's Day kind of gift, in my view, you know, because it says a lot both about your character, Gabe Ortiz, and his relationship with his own teenage son, and it says a lot about the teenage son who's facing unexpected fatherhood of his own. And, you know, and then there's always been Benny and her own father, because her mother has died before the series ever got started.
Right.
So that's and then the father has to relate to his own mother, who's a very strong character, Benny's grandmother. So you've always, I agree with you, you've always had an equally strong theme of, you know, strong men, as well as a particularly strong woman.
And that was important for me to put in my books because one of the things, like I said, when I started writing Fool's Puzzle, I wrote a book that was putting all the things in it that I felt was lacking in what I was reading. I think every writer, when they go to write, that's the thing that if they're a reader, which every writer should be, is you're saying, okay, I love everything out there that I'm reading, but you know what? There's something out there that's not out there, and I'm the person to write it. And what I seem to see a lot of is the books written by men had very strong men characters, and books written by women had very strong women characters. And I said, well, what if you had a book where the male and the female were equally strong? Why does it always have to be one or the other? And even though I grew up in a very matriarchal family, and definitely my mom, you know, and her mom, the women really rule our family, and I come from a family of all girls, no brothers. I'm second out of 4 girls. I've known a lot of strong men in my life. My husband, I've been married to him for 26 years, and he's a very strong man. And I just, I wanted to give men equal time in this. So.
Well, and you've been, I find it, you said you met your husband when you were 15?
15, yes.
And you got married
at 19.
And
We've
here
been
you
married
are.
26 years, yeah.
And I find that so interesting because when I read Fool's Puzzle, one of the things that struck me the most about your first novel was the really moving portrait of grief. Here we have Benny Harper, your lead character, and she's a widow, and she's been happily married, and her husband's been killed in a tragic and relatively senseless accident. And there she is, grieving for it, and trying to work out what her whole life is going to be without him. And that's a theme that has stayed on in the books, although it's gotten lower key. So I was convinced that you were writing from heartbreak, you know, that you must be a widow. When I met you, I was somewhat stunned to discover that, you know, that you weren't. But you said to me recently that you were writing, in fact, about the thing you feared most in this.
Well, I read that one time in a writing book, that this writer, I can't remember who said it, said that if you want to move your audience, you should write about the thing that you fear the most.